They built a $2 million resort on my land. 12 glossy lodges stood where my father's dock once reached into the lake. The sign, Silverwood Resort, gleamed in the noon light, bold as a verdict. A woman in a white suit declared, "Under the new HOA regulation, this property belongs to the community." Community? I stood beyond the fence, watching armed guards block me from my own ground. I wasn't rich. I had no lawyer, no influence. I only had time, patience, and the memory of every inch my father staked in 1956. You ever had neighbors like that? Tell me where you're watching from. What I did next, no one expected. It was 7 a.m. when the world still whispered. Mist lay over the lake like breath on glass, and the pine trees mirrored perfectly in the water. I carried my father's brass depth gauge, the one he made to measure the level each spring, when I pressed it into the water. The ripples spread in clean rings. That sound, the soft touch of metal meeting water, always calmed me. It reminded me that things once built with care endure longer than noise. Then, from across the lake, came a noise that didn't belong. The grinding of an engine, the metallic growl of heavy machinery tearing into soil. I looked up. A yellow excavator clawed at the slope where the old cedar fence once stood. Behind it, workers in orange vests moved with mechanical precision, shovels striking like synchronized weapons. No one had permission to be there. I walked closer along the bank, my boots sinking into damp earth, the smell of diesel stinging the morning air. The closer I got, the more it felt like trespassing on my own land. Then I saw her, Claudia Hensley, stepping from a white SUV, clipboard in hand, posture as straight as her certainty. She greeted me with the kind of smile that comes from paperwork and confidence. "Good morning," she called over the roar of the machines. "We're starting community development here. The board approved it last month." I frowned. "Here, this is private property." Her smile didn't falter. "Oh, that boundary was adjusted under the new zoning revision. You'll want to check with the county." Her tone was calm, as if she'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times before breakfast. Then she waved to the operator to keep digging, turning her back on me mid-sentence. By noon, half the shoreline was cleared. The sound of chainsaws echoed over the lake, shredding the quiet I'd lived in for years. I spent the afternoon digging through my cabinet, boxes of documents, property surveys, notarized papers my father left behind, every record intact. But when I checked the county database online that evening, my deed wasn't there, just gone. No name, no record, nothing but silence where my family's title once lived. That night, I sat on the porch with the brass gauge beside me, watching the construction lights flicker across the water like the heartbeat of a machine devouring memory. At dawn, more trucks came. They erected a fence along the bank, polished metal bars topped with a sign that read, "Private Access." One of the workers said, "HOA orders. We just follow the plan." When I asked who authorized it, he pointed toward Claudia's SUV, parked by the gate like a throne on wheels. She didn't look at me, but she knew I was watching. I called the county office that morning, waited 30 minutes on hold, then another 10 to hear a clerk say, "Your parcel might have been reassigned under Silverwood jurisdiction." I asked what that meant. She said, "It's complicated. That's government talk for, you already lost." By sunset, Claudia finally approached again. Shoes spotless, voice steady. "Mr. Warren, I understand this is hard for you," she said. "But Silverwood is growing, and progress requires shared spaces. You'll still have access to the lake. Of course, through public pathways, on my own soil." I wanted to laugh, but my jaw locked instead. "You said the boundary changed," I said quietly. "Show me where." She paused just long enough for the silence to insult me, then smiled again. "You can request access to the documents through the HOA portal. Transparency is important to us." That night, I went to the attic and opened the old wooden chest I hadn't touched in years. Inside lay the hand-drawn survey my father made, pencil marks fading, corners yellowed. His initials EW scrawled at the bottom beside the note survey confirmed. County seal pending, pending. That single word lit a fire in my chest. Maybe the seal was never filed. Maybe that was the hole they crawled through. I traced the lines of the property with my finger. The lake's curve. The coordinates. The old boundary post he'd driven into the ground himself. Proof existed. It just needed air. The hum of machinery stretched deep into the night, echoing through the trees like a slow invasion. From my window, I could see the new fence gleaming under the moonlight, a scar across the land. I brewed coffee at 11 p.m. and started writing notes, times, names, license plates, the color of every truck. It wasn't a plan yet, but it was the start of one. Somewhere in those details would be a thread that could unravel their lie. When you have nothing left, you start with what you can remember. Memory is a form of evidence. Before going to bed, I walked to the dock. The mist was heavier now, rolling low over the lake. I pressed the brass gauge into the water once more, watching the rings fade into darkness. The land felt patient, as if waiting for me to understand it again. My father once said, "Justice doesn't come when you chase it. It comes when the truth's too heavy to hide." I finally understood. I didn't need to fight them yet. I needed to let them build. Every wall, every lie, every dollar they thought would bury me deeper. When I turned back toward the house, headlights sliced through the fog. Claudia's SUV idled by the fence. For a moment, her silhouette lingered behind the glass. She didn't step out. Maybe she wanted to see how far she could push before I broke. She'd learn soon enough. The next move wouldn't be noise or rage. It would be quiet, deliberate, legal. I whispered to the lake, to the soil beneath me, let them finish. Because when they did, I'd pull the ground from under them, one document at a time. The letter came 3 days later, slipped neatly into my mailbox with the HOA emblem printed in gold at the top. The tone was cold, bureaucratic, and rehearsed. It said my property was subject to compliance penalties for obstructing development access, failure to remove unauthorized structures, and creating a hostile environment for community personnel. I read it twice, then a third time, letting each phrase settle like dust on something once clean. They wanted me to break first, to react, to make myself the problem. The fine listed at the bottom was $1,000. It wasn't about money. It was about dominance. I folded the letter carefully and pinned it to the corkboard beside my father's map. If they thought paper could scare me, they'd forgotten what paper could prove. The next morning at 9 a.m., I walked into the Silverwood Community Hall. The air smelled like disinfectant and power. Claudia stood near the podium, flanked by 2 board members, retired men who looked at her the way dogs look at someone holding a leash. "Mr. Warren," she said with that smooth tone, "we didn't expect you." "I'm sure you didn't," I replied. I asked for the revised zoning file she mentioned. She said it was under digital review and not available for public access yet. I smiled, pretending to believe her. I noticed how the others watched me, cautious, like I carried a contagion of defiance. The meeting continued, full of small talk disguised as policy. Every sentence served her authority, not the law. When I left, a man stopped me by the steps. His name was Dean Marshall, one of the HOA's field coordinators. He leaned in, voice low. "Between you and me, you're not going to win this. The board's already logged you as a non-compliant owner." I asked what that meant. He shrugged, eyes darting around. "Means they'll build anyway, even if they have to bulldoze your fence." He smiled, not with cruelty, but with pity. That's the worst kind of smile. I thanked him and walked away. On the bulletin board near the exit, a printed notice caught my eye: Silverwood Resort opening ceremony, spring next year. So they'd already decided how this story ended. That night. The air smelled of cut timber again. I sat at my desk, flipping through every page of the original survey, matching it against aerial images from public archives. The lake's outline was unchanged, the boundary clear. Their revision couldn't erase topography. Laws might bend under influence, but geography didn't lie. Around midnight, I called an old friend, Ben Foster, who worked at the county records office. He answered groggily, and when I asked about my deed, there was a long silence. "Elliot," he said finally, "I'm not supposed to talk about it, but between us, it looks like someone filed a temporary zoning overlay through the HOA. It gives them jurisdiction, but only if unchallenged for 60 days. I asked when it was filed. He hesitated. 57 days ago. 3 days left. That number pulsed in my head like a countdown. I thanked him, hung up, and leaned back. 60 days. An arbitrary clock built to outlast outrage. Claudia didn't need to prove ownership. She just needed me to stay quiet until the timer ran out. I poured another cup of coffee, opened a new file on my laptop, and began to draft a formal notice of ownership dispute. It had to be filed before the 60th day to freeze the zoning claim. My hands shook slightly as I typed. Not fear, just pressure. The kind that turns a man's patience into weaponry. By morning, the HOA's next move arrived. A bright yellow notice nailed to my fence. Signed by Claudia herself. Unauthorized use of restricted property. Penalty enforced. They fined me $500 for obstructing community progress. The irony almost made me laugh. I took a photo, removed the notice, and placed it neatly into an evidence folder. Let them keep writing. I'd make every word admissible. Later that day, a few neighbors came by, whispering sympathy they didn't dare show publicly. One of them, an older woman named Mrs. Green, said quietly, "They'll ruin you, dear." "She's done it before," I asked. "To who?" She shook her head. "A man by the golf range. He sold and left. She calls it maintaining harmony." That phrase stuck with me. Maintaining harmony. It sounded almost holy, but it was the language of tyranny wrapped in etiquette, the kind that smiles as it steals. That night, I sat on the porch, listening to frogs and generators compete for the same silence. My phone buzzed with another email from the HOA, a reminder of obligations. The signature line glimmered with Claudia's name, elegant and smug. I read it once, then closed it. The more she tried to bury me in forms, the clearer her fear became. She needed control to feel relevant. The next day, I went to the county courthouse. The clerk behind the glass looked tired but kind. I handed over my notarized dispute form, every attachment in order survey scans, property tax receipts, my father's recorded payment from 1956. She flipped through them, stamped the file, and said, "You just stopped them cold." The stamp echoed like a gunshot in the quiet hall. I thanked her and stepped outside, the sun sharp on my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt ground under my feet that no one could take. That evening at 7 p.m., I returned home to find a new letter taped to my gate. Claudia's handwriting this time. Not printed, not official. "You're making this harder than it has to be." It read. No signature, no seal, just that sentence. I stood there, reading it again under the porch light. Harder for who the wind carried the smell of wet pine and diesel, and the faint hum of machinery still echoed across the lake. I folded the note and placed it inside the same evidence folder, right behind the yellow violation slip. Layer by layer, they were building my case for me. As darkness settled, I walked to the dock. The water shimmered faintly, reflecting the resort's half-built frames on the other side. Power looked impressive under floodlights, but it was fragile underneath. It relied on illusion, on people believing they couldn't fight back. I dipped the brass gauge into the lake again, watching the rings spread and fade. The land didn't forget, and neither did I. Somewhere between those ripples and the cold air, I felt calm return. They thought they'd drawn new lines. They just forgot who kept the originals. The rain came that morning like a warning, steady and deliberate. I spent the early hours sorting through the boxes in my study, the smell of old paper mixing with damp air. Each folder carried a lifetime of my father's discipline. Everything dated, signed, cross-referenced. But one section of the file was lighter than it should have been. The folder labeled Boundaries and Revisions had missing pages, torn out clean. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the rain hit the roof. Somewhere, between the maps and the legal jargon, a line had been erased, not by time, but by hands. Around 10 a.m., I drove to the county archives. The building was quiet, a hollow of concrete and fluorescent light. A young clerk at the counter told me most physical maps had been digitized, but I insisted. Old surveys hold details computers miss, I said. She looked doubtful, but led me to the storage room. Rows of rolled maps leaned like forgotten bones against the walls. I unrolled one labeled Silverwood Estates, 1956. And there it was, the original property division, signed but never stamped with the county seal. My land was clearly marked, running 50 feet beyond the current HOA boundary. Proof, right there in ink. But the clerk frowned. "This one isn't in our current system," she said softly. "It's listed as pending verification." Pending. That word again. It followed me like an echo. I photographed every inch of the document, careful to include the initials EW in the lower corner. As I was packing up, an older man appeared in the doorway, silver hair, measuring tape hooked to his belt. "You're Elliot Warren." "Right," he asked. His voice carried the gravel of time. I nodded. "Name's James Holloway. I did the field surveys for Silverwood back in the day." I told him about the new resort, about the lost deed, about Claudia's revised maps. He sighed, rubbing his chin. "I remember your father. Stubborn but fair. The Eastern Bank was never part of the HOA plot. They tried to include it back in the 80s, but the county rejected it." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a weathered notebook. "Here," he said, flipping through yellowed pages. I kept my own notes. "Your family's boundary was clear, ran along the willow line, straight to the dock post." I leaned closer. His handwriting was shaky but confident. "Coordinates precise." "Can I make a copy?" I asked. He smiled. "You don't need to. I'll do one better." From his bag, he took a folded map, stamped and dated, but never filed. "Found this last year when I cleaned out the survey office. Thought it might matter someday." My hands shook slightly as I took it. The paper smelled like dust and vindication. When I returned home that afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the ground slick and reflective. I laid the new map beside the one my father drew. They aligned perfectly. Every tree, every bend of the shore matched. But something else caught my eye. The HOA's new version. The one Claudia waved around at meetings extended the boundary exactly 49 feet into my property. Not 50. 49. Just shy of a legal margin that required federal review. It wasn't coincidence. It was precision theft. Someone knew the system well enough to steal legally. Almost. That night, I scanned both maps and saved copies to multiple drives. Then I wrote a summary of my findings and mailed one sealed copy to myself, a legal timestamp known as the poor man's copyright. My father used to do it for his field reports. "If someone questions your truth," he said, "make time your witness." Around midnight, I called Ben again and told him what I'd found. He whistled softly. "If that map's unregistered, the HOA's entire zoning claim collapses. They built on unverified land." His words settled into me like gravity. "Can I prove that in court?" I asked. "Not yet," he said. "But you're getting close. You'll need someone to certify it." The next morning, I searched for a licensed surveyor outside the county's circle. I found one through a retired engineers forum, a man named Douglas Reed. He agreed to meet the same day. He arrived in a mud-spattered pickup, lean, sunburned, quiet. "I don't work with HOAs," he said, shaking my hand. "You just got lucky catching me between projects." We spent hours walking the property, placing new GPS markers along the old line my father drew. The sun was sharp, the air dry after the storm. When Reed finished, he checked his monitor and nodded. "These coordinates match the original map within 2 inches. The HOA boundary cuts straight into your land. You've got a case." I thanked him, paid in cash, and asked for notarized documentation. He promised to deliver it within 24 hours. Before he left, he looked toward the resort construction. "Funny thing about people like her," he said, meaning Claudia. "They think power is in paperwork. It's not. It's in whoever knows where the truth was buried." He drove off, leaving tire tracks in the mud like fresh signatures. I stood there, watching the half-built resort gleam across the lake, steel skeletons against the sky. They were building faster now, confident, unaware that each nail they drove was fixing them deeper into my evidence. That evening, I sat at my desk, organizing the new documents, my notebook filled with cross-references, page numbers, seal codes. I felt calm, methodical, like I was restoring something sacred. The brass depth gauge sat beside me, a silent witness. Outside, I could hear laughter from the construction crew echoing across the water. I smiled slightly. They were celebrating what they thought was progress. To me, it sounded like a countdown. When the storm passed again that night, I stepped outside. The air smelled of wet pine and clay, the ground shimmering under faint moonlight. Standing at the edge of the dock, I looked across the lake toward the floodlights of the resort. I whispered to the dark, "You built this on my father's soil." The wind carried no answer, but the water rippled in steady circles. Beneath that calm surface, truth waited. Not loud, not violent, just certain. And certainty, when patient enough, becomes justice. Morning came cold and clear, the kind of light that makes everything sharper than it should be. I woke early, brewed coffee, and spread the documents across my kitchen table. The map from Douglas Reed arrived the night before, sealed and notarized, its blue ink still faintly smelling of acetone. Every coordinate matched my father's survey within 2 inches, just as Reed promised. I held the pages to the window, sunlight sliding across the seal like a quiet confirmation. Proof had weight now, not just memory. Outside, I could hear distant hammering from the resort site, each strike echoing across the lake like a countdown I didn't mind anymore. I decided not to confront anyone. Not yet. The plan had to unfold quietly, without warning. I spent the rest of the morning writing a detailed affidavit describing the entire sequence of events: the lost deed, the false zoning, the overlay timing, every letter and fine they sent me. I organized the evidence into numbered sections and printed copies for notarization. By noon, I drove to the small notary office in Evergreen, a place that smelled like ink and patience. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with a calm voice, read the affidavit carefully before stamping each page. "You've done your homework," she said. "Most people come in here angry. You came in ready. Back home, I made 3 sealed copies of the full packet and stored them in different places, one in a safety deposit box, one at Ben's office, and one mailed to myself as a date stamp. Then I called Reed to confirm the survey delivery to the county registrar. He said he'd already submitted it with certified tracking. His tone carried quiet satisfaction. "They won't see it coming," he said. "The moment that file enters the system, it locks the zoning until further review. That's your wedge." I thanked him, hung up, and looked across the lake. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel cornered. I felt anchored. The next few days were silent, almost too silent. The construction noise softened, the trucks fewer. It wasn't progress slowing, it was calculation. Claudia was waiting. People like her don't attack when they're uncertain. They wait for you to relax, then tighten the line. I used that time to document everything else, from photos of the fence to GPS timestamps. I even recorded short clips of the property line markers Reed installed. Every peg hammered into the ground had my initials carved into the side, just small enough to be overlooked, but clear enough to be identified later. Evidence disguised as coincidence. One afternoon, while sorting through receipts, I noticed a car idling across the road, black sedan, tinted windows, unmarked. It stayed there for nearly an hour before driving off. That night, I received another email from the HOA, this one more formal than before. It stated that my continued obstruction of communal progress would result in escalation to legal enforcement. I read it slowly, every word dripping with the confidence of someone who thought I had no counter. They were right, at least for the moment. My counter hadn't happened yet, but when it did, it would not be a message, it would be a filing. At dawn the next day, I met Reed again by the lake for a final verification. He placed his GPS unit on the ground, double-checked each coordinate, and smiled. "Perfect alignment," he said. "Old and new maps match to the inch. You're in the clear." He handed me a printed summary, stamped and signed, with a backup digital copy. I tucked it into the evidence binder before leaving. Reed looked toward the resort and said quietly, "You know, they never expect quiet men to win. They expect noise, anger, mistakes." I nodded. "That's why I stay quiet." By evening, clouds rolled over the mountains, turning the lake into a sheet of gray glass. I sat by the fireplace, drafting a final letter addressed to the HOA board. It wasn't a threat, just a notice, a calm statement that all further communication should be directed through formal legal channels. The letter cited statute numbers, zoning articles, and attached certified survey data. Every word was neutral, factual, deliberate. When I sealed the envelope, I felt something settle inside me, a stillness that came from control. I mailed it at 6 p.m. sharp, the postmark now a silent declaration of war written in ink. 2 days later, the silence broke. I returned home from town to find my mailbox stuffed with glossy HOA newsletters, all containing the same message wrapped in cheerful formatting: Silverwood Resort enters final construction phase with full community support. My name wasn't mentioned, but the subtext was clear. They were trying to erase me from the narrative. I smiled faintly, because erasure only works when no record exists. Mine were multiplying. That same afternoon, Ben called to confirm the county registrar had received and verified my filing. "It's official," he said. "Your property's dispute status is active. Any development on it from now on is legally considered high risk." That night, the wind off the lake carried the hum of generators, but the air felt different. I walked to the dock with the brass depth gauge in hand, pressed it into the water, and watched the rings spread. The metal caught the reflection of the resort lights, bright, artificial, fragile. My father used to say that real power moves like water patient, silent, unstoppable once it finds a path. I finally understood. I didn't need to confront Claudia or demand attention. The paperwork was my voice, and it would echo louder than any confrontation ever could. At midnight, I filed one last set of documents online, a public record request for the HOA's financial disclosures, not out of spite, but curiosity. Systems like theirs always leave trails: funds moved, permits expedited, signatures recycled. If there was corruption, it would show there. When I hit send, I leaned back, listening to the quiet. The lake outside shimmered faintly under moonlight, reflecting both halves of the story, the false resort glowing on one side, my house dark and patient on the other. The truth was already shifting beneath their foundation, and they didn't even know it yet. By the time dawn returned, I felt a calm I hadn't known in months. The air was cold, the mist curling low over the water. I whispered the same words my father once did when he finished his own surveys: "The line holds," and for the first time, I believed it. The resort might keep rising for now, but every beam, every dollar, every document would point back here to this table, this evidence, this silence. Justice doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes as paperwork sliding quietly across a desk, carrying the weight of truth. The notice arrived on a bright morning, folded neatly inside a white envelope with the HOA seal embossed in gold. It was an invitation to the Silverwood community meeting, scheduled for Saturday evening at 6 p.m. Topic: property dispute, clarification, and community cohesion. I almost laughed at the choice of words. Cohesion was Claudia's favorite disguise for control. I could have ignored it, but silence had served its purpose. It was time to step into the room she ruled. That afternoon, I pressed my shirt, organized my files, and placed them into a brown leather folder. Inside lay everything: notarized surveys, legal confirmations, and one stamped court acknowledgement. Quiet proof, ready to speak for itself. Saturday came with dry air and the faint smell of pine. By 5:30, the parking lot outside the community hall was already full. Neighbors stood in small groups, whispering, glancing my way as if guilt could be contagious. Inside, the room buzzed with low voices, the walls lined with posters showing bright renderings of Silverwood Resort shining cabins, happy families, blue water that didn't exist in reality. Claudia stood at the front, smiling like a preacher before a sermon. When she saw me, her expression didn't change, but her eyes did. A flicker of recognition, followed by calculation. At exactly 6 p.m., she tapped the microphone. "Let's begin," she said. Her voice filled the hall, confident and polished. She spoke about progress, community values, and collective prosperity. The crowd nodded, some out of belief, most out of habit. Then her tone shifted. "Unfortunately," she continued, "one resident has made ongoing claims that jeopardize our shared vision." Every head turned toward me. "Mr. Warren has refused to comply with community regulations and continues to obstruct development on land verified under HOA jurisdiction." She gestured toward a projected map on the screen, the same false boundary that cut through my property. "We've tried dialogue, patience, and understanding, but cooperation must be mutual." I waited for her to finish. The room was silent now, every breath suspended. When she stepped back, I rose slowly, carrying my folder to the podium. My voice came out calm, measured. "You said, verified under HOA jurisdiction." I began. "That's an interesting phrase. Verified by who?" Claudia smiled, tilting her head. "By the Silverwood Development Committee, with county oversight." I nodded. "Good. Then perhaps you can explain this." I opened the folder and laid out the first document. The notarized survey by Douglas Reed, stamped and certified by the county registrar. A few people in the front row leaned forward. "This survey, conducted 2 weeks ago, confirms the original boundary recorded by the Warren family in 1956. The lakefront remains privately owned, fully outside HOA jurisdiction." Murmurs rippled through the room. Claudia's smile thinned. "Mr. Warren," she said carefully, "anyone can produce a document. But the HOA's map has legal standing, only if it's registered," I replied, "which yours isn't." I slid the second page forward. The county's verification log, showing her zoning overlay filed but never ratified. "Your boundary extension was never approved. That makes the resort construction illegal." The word hung in the air like a struck bell. Someone near the back whispered, "Is that true?" Claudia stepped forward, her voice sharp. "This is misinformation. Our records are complete." "Then read the next line," I said, pointing to the registrar's seal. "The overlay expires after 60 days without challenge. My dispute was filed on day 59. The law froze your claim." The silence was absolute now. She turned to her board members, but they avoided her gaze. I could see the calculation in her face collapse into disbelief. Years of authority began to crack under the weight of a single stamp. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The document spoke louder than anger ever could. For a moment, no one moved. Then Dean Marshall, the field coordinator, stood up. "If this is true, the resort's insurance is void," he said quietly. "We can't keep building." Claudia snapped. "Sit down, Dean." But her voice trembled. The power she carried was unraveling thread by thread. Right there in front of the people she ruled. I stepped back, giving her space. "You accused me of hostility," I said softly. "All I did was prove ownership. If that's hostility, maybe the problem isn't me." The room filled with whispers, questions, and the rustle of shifting chairs. One man asked if the HOA had misused funds for an unverified project. Another woman demanded to know why they hadn't been told about the legal risk. Claudia tried to speak, but her words dissolved under the noise. Finally, she raised her hand and shouted, "Enough! This meeting is adjourned." She turned off the microphone, but it was too late. Someone was recording on their phone. The scene would spread through the neighborhood before morning. As the crowd dispersed, I gathered my papers, calm and deliberate. Several neighbors approached me quietly, offering nods of apology or whispered thanks. Even Mrs. Green touched my arm and said, "You did it right, dear," with dignity. I smiled faintly. Dignity was all I ever wanted to keep. Claudia walked past me, her heels striking the floor like hammers. She didn't look at me, but I caught the tremor in her breath. Authority, once cracked, never sounds the same again. That night, back home, I placed the documents in their folder and set it gently on the kitchen table. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, carrying faint echoes of the meeting, the gasps, the shifting loyalties. The moment truth landed, I made coffee and sat by the window, the brass gauge glinting beside me. The lake was calm, its surface holding the reflection of the half-built resort, now less like a triumph and more like a monument to arrogance. Before midnight, I received a short email from Ben. Local paper picked up the story. County investigation likely by Monday. I read it twice, then closed the laptop. The world outside was still, the air sharp with the scent of rain. I walked to the dock and looked toward the resort lights across the water. They were still on, but dimmer, flickering against the mist. Power flickers when truth arrives. I whispered, "Let the light fade." That night, for the first time in months, I slept without dreams, somewhere deep in the stillness. The line my father drew all those years ago held firm, and justice, quiet, patient, inevitable, had finally begun to move. By Monday morning, the air in Silverwood felt different. The resort still stood half-built across the lake, but the hum of machinery had stopped. The workers sat idle near the trucks, waiting for orders that would never come. I could tell the story had spread. At 9 a.m. sharp, my phone rang. It was Ben. His voice carried a quiet urgency. "Elliot, the county just froze all development linked to the HOA zoning overlay. There's an active investigation into falsified filings." For a long moment, I said nothing, just stared out the window at the still water. "She'll fight back," I said. "Oh, I'm sure she will," Ben replied. "But this time, she'll have to do it in daylight, by noon." The first knock came. Claudia stood on my porch, dressed in another immaculate suit, this one navy blue. Her expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion. "We need to talk," she said. I gestured for her to come in. She didn't. "The county made a mistake," she began. "You know this will ruin everything, our community, our progress." I kept my voice even. "Our progress. You mean the resort on private land?" She exhaled sharply, as if frustrated that I wouldn't play the old roles of resistance and compliance. "You don't understand what's at stake. Do you think this place survives without investment?" I said. "It survived before you arrived." She glared at me, then turned, her heels striking the porch with finality. "You'll regret this, Mr. Warren." I almost smiled. I already did. Now I'm correcting it. That evening, I sat at my desk reviewing the evidence again, this time with new eyes. It was no longer defense, it was prosecution. Ben had sent copies of county records showing that the HOA's zoning proposal had been submitted using a duplicate signature Claudia's own, forged under an outdated authorization code. I stared at the screen, letting the gravity of it sink in. It wasn't just manipulation, it was fraud. The next step wasn't mine to take. It belonged to the law. I printed the files, sealed them, and prepared them for the investigator scheduled to visit the next morning. When the knock came at 8:30 a.m., the man on the porch introduced himself as Inspector Caldwell from the county's land use department. He was polite, deliberate, the kind of man who'd seen too many power plays dressed as civic duty. We went through every document, every photograph, every timestamp. He asked few questions, just nodded as he took notes. When we finished, he said quietly, "You've done most of my job for me. We'll subpoena the HOA's internal communications today. I asked if it would take long. He smiled faintly. Not when the media's already watching. By mid-afternoon, chaos had reached the HOA office. Through the window, I could see people gathered near the hall, arguing in low, frantic voices. Cars came and went, carrying board members who no longer wanted to be associated with the mess. At 5 p.m., Claudia sent an email to all residents announcing her temporary leave to assist with the ongoing administrative review. No apology, no explanation, just polished avoidance. But that wasn't enough. Not yet. Truth needed witnesses. The next day, the county scheduled a public hearing to address the zoning fraud. The hall was full again, same walls, same chairs, but the air carried a different charge. Reporters sat in the back, cameras pointed at the podium. I took a seat in the second row, my folder on my lap. When Claudia entered, heads turned. She looked smaller now, her confidence stripped down to survival instinct. The commissioner called the session to order. "We are here to determine the legitimacy of the Silverwood zoning overlay," he said. "Mr. Warren, your evidence has been reviewed and accepted as valid. Ms. Hensley, you may respond." Claudia stood, voice low but controlled. There must have been a clerical error. The overlay was submitted in good faith, based on the best available information. The commissioner raised an eyebrow. "So you're claiming your own signature was forged without your knowledge?" Her silence stretched too long. "It was an administrative oversight," she said finally. I opened my folder, placed a printed email on the table in front of me, and slid it forward. "This message," I said, "was sent from Ms. Hensley's HOA account to the contractor 3 days before the overlay was submitted. It references the revised boundary by name." The commissioner read it, then looked at her. "Ms. Hensley, that's your direct authorization." The room was quiet except for the sound of her breath. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked. "I did what was necessary for the community." The commissioner replied, "You falsified a government filing. That's not necessity. That's a felony." Cameras flashed. The board members avoided her eyes. Dean Marshall sat motionless, his expression somewhere between pity and relief. I felt no triumph, only inevitability. The truth had been patient, and now it stood in the open. Undeniable. Claudia was escorted out of the hall for questioning. She didn't look back. After the session, neighbors approached me, some apologetic, some stunned. "You really did it," one man said. "You actually stopped them." I shook my head. "No. The law did. I just reminded it where to look." The commissioner handed me a copy of the public record, officially recognizing my property's original boundary. "You're clear. Mr. Warren," he said, "and the county will move to suspend all HOA authority until audits are complete." I thanked him quietly and stepped outside. The sky was pale blue, the air still after the storm of voices inside. That night, I walked to the dock again, the brass gauge in hand. The lake was calm, its surface unbroken except for the faint reflection of the unfinished resort. Construction lights still glowed faintly across the water, but no one worked. The site felt abandoned, caught between arrogance and consequence. I lowered the gauge into the water and whispered, "The line holds." The rings spread slowly, disappearing into stillness. For the first time. That phrase didn't sound like defiance. It sounded like peace. Later, as I sat by the fire, Ben called. "It's over," he said. "They're charging her with document fraud and property misrepresentation. The county froze all HOA accounts. You just dismantled a machine." "Elliot," I said quietly. "No, it dismantled itself. I just made sure the lights were on when it happened." We both laughed softly. Then silence settled. Not awkward, but earned. By midnight, the lake outside was black and endless. I watched the faint glow of the resort fade as power cut off one section at a time. Each darkened cabin felt like a confession. Each flicker a truth reclaiming its place. The world didn't celebrate, but it didn't need to. Justice had no music. It only needed witnesses. And tonight, the lake was one of them. The next morning came quiet. almost too quiet. No trucks, no shouting, no engines. The air over Silverwood was still, as if the land itself was exhaling after months of holding its breath. I walked down to the dock, coffee in hand, and looked across the lake. The resort stood motionless, its half-built cabins already fading against the dawn. Without workers or permits, it was just wood and steel, empty of purpose. The wind carried only birdsong and the faint creak of the dock beneath my feet. For the first time in a long while, it felt like the land was mine again. By noon, word had spread. The county confirmed the HOA's dissolution pending investigation, and local reporters gathered by the entrance of the once grand Silverwood Gate. They filmed as the official sign came down, bolts screeching from rusted metal. Dean Marshall gave a brief statement, calling it a necessary reset for the integrity of the community. His voice trembled slightly. Claudia's name was nowhere in his speech. She had already been taken to county court for arraignment, charged with falsifying documents and unauthorized development. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who once claimed to own everything now had to ask permission to leave town. I didn't go to the hearing. I didn't need to see it. Justice didn't require my applause. Ben called that evening to confirm the county had voided all HOA fines and penalties against me. "Your property's clean," he said. "Every inch of it." I thanked him quietly, though words felt too small for the moment. Outside, I could hear the faint hum of dismantling machines reversing what arrogance had built. Every beam, every screw taken down under supervision. Watching it was strangely peaceful. Not revenge, just restoration. Later that night, I opened my father's old ledger again. Between his handwritten notes, I found a single line I'd never noticed before. It read, "Land remembers who listens." I traced the words with my finger. The ink faded but certain. Maybe that's what this fight had been about all along, not possession, but memory keeping a promise made by hands steadier than mine. I went outside, the air cool and clean, and sat by the lake, across the water. Floodlights dimmed one by one as the workers packed their tools. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. The next week, the county sent me an official deed confirmation, stamped and sealed. It was more than paper, it was closure. I framed it beside my father's map on the living room wall. When the sunlight hit both at once, the ink shimmered like something alive. The neighbors began stopping by again, some to apologize, some to help. Mrs. Green brought a basket of apples, saying softly, "It feels like the town can breathe again." I smiled. Maybe it just needed truth. She nodded. Truth and patience. On Friday evening, I walked the full boundary for the first time in years. The grass was tall where the fence once stood, the soil still marked by heavy tires. Near the edge of the lake, I found one of Reed's GPS stakes, the red paint already fading. I left it there as a marker not of conflict, but of proof that silence can outlast noise. As I stood there, the last light of sunset turned the water gold. It felt like forgiveness, not for them, but for the land and for myself. When darkness settled, I returned to the dock. The brass gauge rested beside me, the same tool that started all of this. I dipped it into the water once more, watching the ripples stretch outward, soft and endless. Behind me, the resort stood in shadows, waiting for the county to reclaim its materials. Ahead, the lake reflected the moon, calm and untouched. I whispered into the night. The line holds, not as defiance, but as gratitude, for truth, for memory, for the quiet kind of justice that doesn't shout, it just endures. Spring returned to Silverwood slower that year. The lake thawed in soft layers, sunlight touching the water like forgiveness. The old fences were gone, the ground bare and honest again. Where the resort once stood, only the concrete foundations remained, scattered and silent, like remnants of a dream that never belonged here. I stood at the edge of my property one morning, hands in my pockets, listening to the wind weave through the pine trees. It carried no sound of construction, no commands,
No false promises, just the hum of life returning.
For the first time in years, the quiet didn't feel like absence. It felt like peace. The county had finished clearing the site a few weeks earlier. Trucks came and went, hauling away what used to be ambition wrapped in greed. They left behind clean soil and a letter confirming the restoration of the original boundaries. I framed that letter beside my father's deed. Together, they looked less like trophies and more like a dialogue between generations, proof that some lines, once drawn, should never be crossed. The county commissioner called once more to thank me for my cooperation and for providing evidence that saved the town millions in legal liability. I told him I didn't do it for the town. I did it for the land, for memory, for something simple dignity. He paused before replying. That's exactly what the town needed. Over time, the neighbors started visiting again, less cautious now. Mrs. Green brought her grandkids to feed the ducks. Dean Marshall stopped by one afternoon, his face aged by regret more than years. He handed me a folded letter, his resignation from the HOA board, though there was no board left to resign from. "You were right," he said quietly. "We thought she was building something for us. Turns out, we were building it for her." I nodded. "Everyone builds for someone," I said. "The trick is knowing who deserves it." He smiled faintly before walking back down the dirt path. By summer, the land had changed again. Wild grass grew where polished tiles once shone. The lake reclaimed its shoreline inch by inch, erasing the last traces of false ownership. I spent the days repairing what could be saved: the dock, the fence posts, the small boathouse my father built half a century ago. Ben visited one weekend, bringing a bottle of bourbon and 2 glasses. We sat by the dock at sunset, the water calm and gold. "So," he said, "what happens now?" I took a slow sip, feeling the warmth spread through me. "Now, nothing happens. And that's the beauty of it," he laughed. "You realize you became a legend in this town, right? The man who let them finish a $2 million resort just to bury them with paperwork." I smiled. "Legends are for people who enjoy attention. I just wanted the truth on record." The local paper ran one last story a few weeks later. The headline read, "Silverwood restored land returned to original owner." It was factual, understated, and perfect. No dramatics, no glorification, just a statement of balance restored. I cut out the article and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. Beneath it, I wrote a single note in pencil: "Justice isn't loud." That phrase stayed with me, echoing through quiet mornings and still nights. Sometimes justice whispers. Sometimes it arrives on stamped paper instead of thunder. And sometimes it waits for decades until someone decides to listen. Claudia never came back. The county sold her property at auction. The proceeds used to reimburse residents for the HOA's debts. Her name faded from conversation, replaced by lessons people learned the hard way. The land she once tried to claim became public green space, open to everyone. I visited once, just to see it. The air smelled of cedar and wet soil. Children were playing near the shore, laughing without the weight of history. I stood there for a while, then turned away. That chapter was closed, not erased, just ended, properly. As the years rolled on, Silverwood began to heal, without the HOA. Neighbors talked more, argued less, fixed things together instead of filing complaints. The lake became a place of memory again, not control. I restored my father's dock completely, even rebuilt the small wooden sign that once hung at its entrance. The line holds. Every time I stepped onto that dock, I felt his presence not as a ghost, but as a quiet reminder that integrity doesn't age. It just waits for its moment. One evening, as the sun sank low and turned the water to fire, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief, something deeper. Gratitude, maybe, or reconciliation. The brass depth gauge sat beside me, polished and steady. I lowered it into the water, the ripples spreading across the lake like gentle applause. "We're done, Dad," I whispered. "The land's safe." The reflection in the water showed a face older than I remembered, but calm. The fight had taken time, but it had given something greater in return, a reminder that justice, when done with patience, outlives every lie. I looked across the lake, where the lights of town twinkled faintly through the trees. Life had moved on, but truth remained, and that was enough. The world doesn't always reward the quiet ones, the ones who fight with reason instead of rage. But sometimes, when the dust finally settles, you find that the quiet ones are the only ones still standing. So, if you've listened this far, remember this: power doesn't always wear a suit or carry a title. Sometimes it's just a man, a piece of paper, and the courage to say no when everyone else nods. Justice doesn't roar. It writes. It waits. And when the time is right, it stands. If this story moved you, if you've ever faced a system that tried to erase your voice, then you know what Elliot Warren felt. The quiet fight for dignity, the long road to truth, the patience it takes to see justice come full circle. Share your thoughts below and tell us, what does justice mean to you? Your voice matters here. Subscribe and stay with us at the HOA Stories, where every tale reminds us that truth, even when buried under rules and arrogance, always finds its way back to the surface.